Round 1 of the FIDE Candidates Tournament 2024. We are doing the recap right here, right now. This game just ended, or this round just ended, I should say. We have Hikaru versus Fabiano, Nepo versus Abasov, Prague versus Firouzja, a clash of the young generation, and Vidit versus Gukesh, a clash of the young generation from India. There was many brilliant moves today. I'm not going to give away the results, though I'm actually leaving them in the board display. So you could see the results. Let me know if that ruins the experience. I'll take it out for future rounds. But good games nonetheless. So Hikaru versus Fabiano. And by the way, this is a 2-week tournament. If you're not familiar, it's a 2-week tournament with some rest days in between. The winner of this tournament faces Ding for the World Championship match. So I'd say it's a pretty big tournament. Fabi opens with e4 as per usual, and Hikaru does not go for the Berlin, he goes for the Sicilian. So we're going to get some fighting chess, we can assume. Knight f3, the sharpest response, the open Sicilian, and it all looks normal until Hikaru plays e5. Now you might be familiar with this in the Sveshnikov, however, that is delayed a few moves. This is a very early e5, and it's not so popular. This move has not been popular since the late 90s, so it's been out for quite a long time. The line is dubious at best. It creates a backwards D pawn, and typically in these setups, I know Magnus likes this backwards pawn. Actually, in the Fabiano versus Magnus match, the World Championship match, that's when the Sveshnikov became popularized. No, this is not the Sveshnikov, but it's a similar pawn structure. He likes that backwards pawn, though the backwards pawn has to become unbackwards at some point. Black needs to play d5 to fight for counterplay in the middle game. That is the plan. Here, since a6 has not been played yet, the way to punish this line is to go bishop to b5. You can block with the bishop, though it is better to block with the knight. Reason being, if you block with the bishop, white just takes and then moves backwards. And basically, you're just arguing, hey, you're never going to play d5. My position is coordinated. Your bishop is stupid. I'm going to win. They don't actually say that during the game. Imagine if chess players could like talk smack during the game. I feel like chess would be so much more entertaining to watch. And imagine the blunders they would make if you like get inside your opponent's head. I think chess tournament, there should, okay, maybe not in all, but there should be tournaments where you can talk trash. I think that would be amazing. And I wonder if these top players would play worse chess. Like, I wonder if you would just disrespect them and then they'd get mad and tilt. You know, like trash talking. Makes things fun to watch, at least. Anyways, this is a recap of the tournament. So, knight to d7. Pinning yourself, but developing the knight. Now, you might see that the bishop no longer guards f5, and that is why white plays knight to f5. Aiming at the backwards pawn. Backwards pawn meaning if it is pushed, it'll get taken. That's why it's backwards. Now a6, kicking out the bishop. And here's kind of a critical position. So in the database, everything under the sun has been played. Bishop c4, bishop a4, bishop takes knight, bishop e2, bishop d3. Bishop c6 has not been played in the Masters database. I'm sure it's been played in the Lichess database. It's also potentially a mouse slip. And bishop f1 is ridiculous. So, what should Fabi do? What did he do? Often different questions. He decided to go bishop a4, and I do like this retreating approach. You're going to allow black to develop on the queen side and get some counterplay. But if you think about it, Nakamura prepared this. Fabi probably doesn't look at this often because it's a super rare sideline. So look at the line. If bishop takes knight, queen takes, bishop g5 is the only way to play for an advantage. There is knight takes e4, blundering a knight, except that it is not blundering a knight because there is queen takes the other knight, so it's actually winning a pawn. But there is an in-between move for white. Knight takes g7, bishop takes, and it's very complicated. Knight takes black castles. So Fabi's like, yeah, this guy's probably looked at this for hours. I don't want none of this. None of this. It's super complicated. Actually, it wouldn't be queen takes d6. It would be f6, even though both are in the database. There's so many tricky lines. Like the bishop retreats, the queen comes in, g2 is being aimed at, and at the end of the day, black has the bishop pair and is ahead in development. So Fabi didn't want to go into this. Also, there's a lot of trickier lines that are slightly worse. I don't know how dubious Nakamura was going to get today. But Bishop a4, a principled move, just sliding back, allowing b5, retreating the bishop. Now knight c5, gaining a tempo on the bishop, opening up black's bishop respectively, making it potentially easier to play d5 in the future, potentially. Bishop g5 pinning, Sveshnikov ideas, because it's the same pawn structure. Doubling of the pawns. And bishop e7, unpinning themselves. Fabi does take, so a lot of the ideas are similar. It's almost transposing idea-wise. This bishop looks misplaced. However, if black plays e4, it's going to be a good bishop. So we get castles, e4, so it's a pretty good bishop. But knight takes e4. Chess.com actually gives this a brilliancy. I think a lot of people would play this. Knight takes e4. Point is, knight is forced to recapture, and now you pin the knight, winning it. There's no d5 because you could just take that, and then you're still going to win the knight, and you're also attacking the bishop. So d5 would be ridiculous. Castles getting out of the way of the pin, and we get a rook lift. Now bishop takes b2, picking up the pawn, so it's equal material. But white's position is more comfortable to play. He's up a tempo, and he blockades the isolated pawn. Blockade the isolated pawn. It's a good rule of thumb. You also have a battery, so there's no rook e8. The simple stuff. Rook c8, queen b7, infiltrating into the position. And now black cannot sit back. If black sits back, he's going to get squeezed into a loss in this position. Nakamura never sits back. He's very active. I find his personality hard to stomach, but his chess is very, very good. Very active, rook c5, aiming at this pawn. He's like, you take that pawn, I take this pawn. So Fabi takes this pawn, and Fabi loses that pawn. That's how chess works. Rook d1, aiming in at the isolated pawn, building pressure. And now we get d5. So everything's hanging on a razor's edge. Rook b4, the critical move. Even though the pawn was not attacking the rook, you want to activate your rook. Aim at this pawn because now the d5 pawn is obstructing the vision of the black's rook to b5. We get bishop c3, which is an inaccuracy until you see how crazy this idea is. Here, try to guess what black played. Pause the video. It is a crazy move. I think it's very hard to guess. You can unpause the video. The move is rook takes f2. This move is, well, I don't know how you look at this position and think of rook takes f2. I mean, that is utter genius. Even though it's a blunder, still utter genius. You might be like, hey, doesn't that blunder a rook? And well, actually, no, it doesn't. Queen h4, and the best white has here is a perpetual, right? Because king g1, right, if g3, black just comes in. So king g1, we get bishop to d4. The rook can't even take, because then you actually get mated in one move. So you're like, okay, what if I just go king h1? But now bishop e5, and the king is stuck in the corner. If h3, you get queen g3, very hard to get out of mate. If g3, also very hard to get out of mate because this pawn is pinned. So quite ridiculous stuff. We get rook d2 and everything draws here. Queen e4 is one example of a draw. So Fabiano thinks for a little bit and he finds the only move for an advantage, which is rook b takes d5. It's still scary. The queen comes in. And look at the time. Fabi has 20 minutes to make 16 moves. But there's a lot of pieces on the board and the king is open. So it's starting to get scary even though he has a winning advantage. Queen d3, the best move, gaining a tempo on the bishop and tripling up. On the d file, tripling up is very, very strong. So rook f6 backing up and g3 giving his king some space. Also the best move. You might say, hey, didn't Nakamura just blunder a bishop? Well, yes, except the fact that Fabi would then get checkmated, right? This is one of those generic chess.com puzzles. So he did not fall for that, luckily. Queen b4, king g2, gaining space with his king, getting on the light squares. There are no checks, right? They have a dark square complex, so getting on the light squares, no checks, especially if there's no openings. And here, Fabi gives away his advantage. So I believe he did this because he was short on time, and his king is out in the open. So he didn't want to risk losing, so he put himself in a position where 9 times out of 10 it's going to be a draw. Maybe even 10 times out of 10. Rook d7 was the way to play for a win, because as you could see, there is a lot of open lanes to the king, but none that can actually be used. Nakamura cannot check white's king, and at the end of the day, you're tripled up, you're aiming at f7, you have a outside passed pawn, and black's rook could never move because of checkmate. So I guess this isn't checkmate, but this is just a winning position for white, right? Because you're going to laterally win their queen. So he should have stayed tripled up, but I understand there's no increment. There's no increment, I think, until move 40. So he just put himself in a safe position. So he traded off a pair of rooks and then brought his queen here to protect the promotion square, as well as gain a tempo on the bishop. We get queen e7. Black is now regrouping. Opposite color bishop endgames. This is probably going to be a draw, but let's see how he does it. He does it in brilliant fashion with the move rook to a8. You might be like, so many blunders this game. And I agree, it looks like it. So why can the queen not take the rook? Well, queen e2 check. If you go back, you're going to get mated. If you go forward, the best thing you have is a perpetual. Because after queen takes rook, let's say you push the pawn, you actually do get mated. Queen h5, king g2, queen e2, king h3, you are in a mating box. You might be like, well, I'll just go queen g2. Or actually better, I'll just go g4. But then they go h5, prying it open. Now if queen g2, pawn takes pawn, it just doesn't work, right? King g3, bishop e5 is mate in 1. King can't take the pawn. And if queen takes the pawn, there are queen f1, pawn g4 check. This is amazing. It's one of those positions with those bishops and queens where you're just on the wrong color at the wrong time. And here, this is just going to be mate. Excuse me. You also lose the queen. So the best thing there would be a threefold repetition. So after rook a8, he does not take the rook. He does not take the bait. But now rook a7, this is a defensive fortress. How are you ever going to get these pieces off the dark squares when you have a light square color complex? You're never going to do it. So this pawn is stuck. It's jammed up, and it's never going to become unjammed. Hikaru comes after the a pawn, and it's just a matter of time now until the game fizzles out into a draw. Looks a little scary. Fabi is still up a pawn, but as we know, opposite color bishops tend to favor draws. The desired outcome, or the often outcome, is often a draw. So in this position, they agreed to draw. Nothing much to play for. They're going to need to trade off queens, or Fabi is, and then one pawn advantage will do nothing. Now we are going to look at another crazy game. There were 3 crazy games today and 1 pretty boring game, but I'm going to save the boring game for last. So if you don't want to watch it, that is fine. We're going to look over the 3 crazy games first. I'm always going to look over all the games though. I mean, there's only 8 players. There's only 4 games. Easy. So we get a Queen's Gambit declined. Just sure they've played this thousands of times. So many games in the database. Very boring stuff. So many ways to play this. They play it in this way. D takes c5, bishop takes b4, getting a tempo on the bishop. But this game gets interesting super quickly. Because here it's typically like c takes d5, bishop b2, both sides get castled, boring stuff. Here, Vidit, with the white pieces, plays rook a2. Obviously, computer prep. I've seen this idea in the Sicilian, doubling up on the d file. This was also in the Ding Nepo World Championship match. But rook a2, the point is you're rook lifting over to the d file, doubling up on the d file, pinning this pawn. So we get knight e5 and rook to d2. The reason you might say, hey, doesn't that win a pawn? Actually, it does not. Because if knight takes, bishop takes, something like pawn takes, you cannot do this because of rook takes d6. So that does not win material. So we get knight takes f3, and he takes with the pawn. So very weird position. It was only recently where players can play like this. Double up their f pawns, leave their king in the center, and bring their rook to the center of the board before they've even moved either bishop. It's breaking every single principle in chess, and I like it. It's aggressive. Castles, because he does not see ghosts. Gukesh castles like a savage into an open g file. Terrifying to do, but also the best move. They're good at chess, what could I say? Bishop b2, aiming in like a sniper rifle onto g7. And we get a5, a counter strike, right? You want to numb the incoming attack with counterplay. If you just play passively, they're just going to run you over. And the point is, if b takes a5, queen takes, all of a sudden, it is black who has everything to play for. Just like that, a position can go wrong. We got c takes d5. My apologies. Point is, well, actually, the best move was c5, this barricade against the bishop. But okay, cd5, opening up the d file, makes a lot of sense. Now, e5. There was multiple moves here, but I do like e5. Because if your opponent spent all of his prep doubling up on the d file, and then you just blockade his own pawn on the d file, and shut down both his bishop and rook, his prep has gone down the drain. So I think this was a principled, or mature decision, rather. It also opens up the light squared bishop. We get knight to b5, an aggressive move, trying to get the bishop to move to jam the pawn through. But we get a takes b4. Of course, white does not want to take because of bishop takes b4. You might say, hey, aren't I holding on? The answer is barely. This is no fun. Now you're going to pay the price for leaving your king in the center of the board. You're all pinned. So he removes the bishop. Logical. A takes b4, queen takes b4, queen c2. Trying to develop and get out. Now, comment down below. Do you think Hikaru's rook takes f2 was more impressive? Or do you think Gukesh's next move in this position? I don't know what they're thinking. Like, you look at this position. Let's look at it from black's perspective for a second. You look at this position and you're like, okay, maybe I'll take the pawn, right? That's a pinned rook. And this is a good continuation, by the way. There's many good moves. Bishop takes e5, and everything hangs in the balance. I honestly would prefer black here, just because there's a lot of open lanes, though white obviously has counterplay, and it is a completely balanced position. What else do you look at? Maybe you look at rook e8 guarding the pawn, and you're like, he's pinned, so I could just take my time. In this position, this absolute savage plays bishop to g4. Like, what makes you think of this move? I don't know. And this effectively forces a draw. Because every move here for white loses, except for the move bishop to c3. So let's go over it. Why can the pawn not just take the bishop? Their calculation is insane. So first move, not so crazy. Rook fc8, just gaining activity because you just gave up a piece. So now their queen has to move. Queen d3 is the best. Now try to find the sequence. The sequence begins with rook to a1 check. Point being, the king goes up and e4 traps the queen in the middle of the board. Crazy stuff. Okay, so you're like, well, bishop takes rook, right? That's a free rook. Well then, same problem. Rook c1, the rook cannot go back because of the pin. So the king goes up, e4, and the queen is trapped. Insane. Insane. So that is really the only logical continuation to look at. Like, queen c4 maybe trying to trade off, but this doesn't make too much sense, right? Because bishop takes f3, and black is just up a pawn, and white is his king's toast. So black would be winning here. So in this position, after bishop to g4, the players agree to repeat moves, and the game is a drawn. Draw number 2. Brilliancies in both games. And yeah, by the way, I think bishop, in my opinion, bishop g4 is more insane than rook takes f2. Because that's just my opinion. Bishop g4, who looks at that? That's crazy stuff. Now we're going to look at the most insane game of the day. I don't even know what to tell you. This one is a special treat. So we get a Ruy Lopez, an open Ruy Lopez, where Prague is playing black and decides to grab the pawn on e4. This has been played so many times, right? Black gets d5, and we get a complex position in the center of the board. So many moves here. Not doing an opening video on it. There's going to be much to talk about in the middle game. So bishop g4, queen e1. It is the main move, but it's also a crazy move, right? Because you can open up the king, but then they gain a tempo on your knight, and they do have the bishop pair, and they're going to throw pawns at you. Oops, I'm sorry. Hope that doesn't make you click off the video. But if it does, that's fine. Okay, so we get knight c5, retreating the knight, and knight bd2. No more doubled pawns, you might say. Knight e6, this is a fascinating reroute. The point is to get to f4, where the knight is a savage. I don't know why we're saying savage a lot today, but we just start. King h1, you might be like, okay, I've seen prophylactics before. It looks odd, but whatever. Bishop to h5, sliding out of a non-existent tempo loss. And now we get bishop takes knight. So we're entering this position where white gets doubled pawns, and now king h1 looked super logical, right? Not that the king could have gotten punished on the g file, but now white can use the g file if black so opts to castle. So king h1, you see the idea in full motion. Now, kind of like in those old Benoni setups, black benefits from this dark squared bishop trade. Even though in the Benoni, your pawns are on dark squares, it's just a similar idea. I'm used to this bishop g5 trade from those types of positions. White trades on their own terms, and this is all prep. I mean, if you're taking with the knight, this is prep. You're not telling me it's not prep. And the point is that it's clear. See, it's weird because you just think to take with the rook, even the queen. But the idea becomes clear after taking with the knight. The idea is to push the f pawn up one, up another, and then blow open black's king. So black needs to be super, super careful with his next few moves. Of course, Prague being the beast that he is, move that is queen to h4, taking advantage of the fact that white's pawn structure is no bueno on the king side. Rook to g4, an active move, and queen now comes to h5. We're aiming at this. Maybe the rook is pinned. It's a pretty good queen. I would be scared as black here, though. I do like white's position. I really do. I don't know. It's equal, though. Knight to d3, supporting the pawn, supporting this guy. Maybe in the future, going to c5 if this knight moves and you want to blow open the center with pawn to e6. Prague castles, very, very scary, but these people do not see ghosts. And now queen to e2, guarding this pawn. Arguably, queen e3 was better because it'll never come into a tempo gain from one of the knights. But both well within the balance. Okay, now this game is going to start heating up. Prague goes f5, and I love this decision because basically what it does is it forces the move en passant, which allows Prague to rook lift. Right now it's like who's attacking who. You're guarding everything on the 6th. You're coming into the 6th not only to defend, but to attack. And this pawn structure is very, very bad. So it's well within the balance, and both sides are attacking each other. Pawn to f4. And just to show you tricky stuff, let's say this knight moved somewhere. Rook takes g7. Have you ever fallen into this tactic on chess.com? Be honest. I have. I think everybody has. But hopefully not in classical chess. So f4, that is an attack. That is a tactic to be aware of. It's not why white went queen e2, but it's something interesting in the position. So now if this knight moves, there's always going to be rook g5, aiming at the queen, aiming at the pawn. This exists, and easy to triple up on the g file soon to come. Rook h6, threatening mate. f3, stopping mate, right? These doubled pawns do bump into each other, but at least we're guarding h2. Rook f8, maybe rook lifting, maybe tying white down to these horrendous f-pawns, and we get queen f2. So now it becomes kind of a maneuvering game. Rook ff6 and rook e1, aiming at the semi-open file. There could be checkmates there potentially. Now Prague plays a beautiful move. Only move to keep the game in the balance, queen f7. And this is kind of what you want to do. You want to build up against the weakest point of your opponent's position. That is these double isolated pawns. So a retreating move to build pressure on the horrible structure of your opponent. That is good positional chess. That is positional chess in a nutshell. We got queen g3, right? Defending the pawn, doubling up on the g file. And now rook h5. Rook lifting, trying to rook lift over. This is just a major piece brilliancy by both these players. High level stuff. a4. At the moment, there is no attack on white's king, so counter strike. That is what you should do. If all the focus is on one side of the board, shift focus over to the other side of the board. it either makes your opponents not able to coordinate an attack, or they get tunnel vision and they're like, oh, there's another side of the board in this game? That's crazy. I didn't know that. I swear, it's easy to forget. Rook HH6, rook E2, guarding against these H2 threats. Now we get rook H3, hitting the queen, aiming at the pawn, and we get queen to E1, gambiting the pawn. Now keep in mind, we are on move 29, so they have 10, 11 moves to make. Quick math. And look at this position. Not to mention, Fallujah has less than 5 minutes on the clock, and Prague has 10 minutes on the clock. Now, knight c5 is a very good move. You might be like, isn't that a free knight? Yes, but no, right? That's kind of how chess is. Point is, queen f8, you have to give up a queen. So that is not good. Now we got queen h5, and the game really heats up. The move to keep the game in the balance was knight f8, but you never really want to be this passive, especially when you're entering time pressure. It's just very, very hard. Like, there's going to be only moves to keep this game in the balance, and that's just impossible when you run low on time. So I like the idea of active counterplay. Queen h5. Now, what do you think the only move for white to gain an edge here is? Well, it is rook to g2. This is the only move that proves a slight advantage for white. Now, crazy enough, the move black has to play is knight to e5. And here, we would get f takes e5. Like, is that a free knight? Yes, but no, as always. Queen f7, aiming in at f1 check, trying to win the queen. You might be like, well, don't I just have rook g1? This move actually loses to rook f2. The coordination in this game is crazy. Rook 4 to g2, rook takes h2, the king is trapped, and there's basically mate. Queen to f3. Right? Queen h3, rook h2, queen takes. And if the other rook guards, then you win the queen. And this rook is pinned. I don't know how much of that Prague saw, but yes, queen f7. So what did Fallujah need to do? He needed to go bishop to d3 guarding f1. Now it just goes into this crazy mess where queen takes g7, queen takes g7. If there's a trade, it's in the balance, but apparently they have this queen g1 move, and white is better. No shot are they finding this with this little time on the clock. Right, knight e6, rook takes, knight takes. White is slightly better. Like, okay, sure. Super unrealistic. So in all of this craziness, Fallujah plays the move knight takes e6. And we get queen takes g4, knight g5. Do not blunder, checkmate in one move. And what is the only move now? You have to close off the e file. So knight e5. And in this position, you can actually not take the knight. It looks like a hanging knight, but it is not, because now your pieces are obstructed by the view of the pawns, and black's pieces are very much not obstructed, not to mention he's up in exchange and a pawn. So we get knight e5. The rook does take, and do you see how black bails out with a draw? It is rook takes pawn. So a lot of rook sacrifices today and bishop sacrifices. But yeah, that's the third rook sacrifice today. Rook takes h2, and we get a perpetual. So those were the three craziest games from today. As always, we're going to look through all of the games. So the last game is very boring. If you want to click off, that is fine by me. You're not going to be missing anything. We have a Bossov versus Nepo. We get a Queen's Gambit, and we get a modern variation with this bishop to g5. Now we get h6, and there's two ways to play it. One way to play it is snap off the knight, and then snap off the pawn, and the reason being is the knight can't take. And white is happy that the knight can't take, because now the bishop faces a pawn wall. This is one way for white to play. Another way for white to play is to retreat the bishop and keep the tension. We get the ladder. Now c5, the most annoying move for d4 players to face. We get knight f3 and a pawn exchange in the center of the board. Now white has an isolated pawn. So what white wants to do is be very, very active, hopefully chuck the pawn up the board eventually, and trade it off for a non-isolated pawn, and you're more active. Life is good. An isolated pawn is good when there's a lot of pieces on the board. When it's an endgame, it's a liability. So the more pieces get traded off the board, more of a liability the isolated pawn is, right? Makes sense. We got knight c6, castles, castle. This is still large theory that they're following. White is using his isolated pawn to gain the open and semi-open files. A balanced position, still in the database. White finally snaps off the knight. Everything's about timing, and d5, getting rid of his isolated pawn, right? Trades start to happen, so get rid of your weakest pawn. So he trades off the pawn, Abasov does. Oh, by the way, there's like a 130-point difference between these players. So a draw for Abasov is not bad. Even though he does have the white pieces, you're facing Nepo. Nepo is strong. He also, it was smart to kind of go into this open, balanced trading endgame because Nepo is very good with a lot of pieces on the board. Queen d4, we get a bunch of trades where black is slightly better because it is a bishop versus knight on an open board. But at this level, this is just a draw. We get pawn f3. Nepo doubles up the pawns, but this is just a draw. You can trade off one pair of rooks and leave the other pair of rooks on the board. And basically, this is a draw because it's a fortress. There's no entrance for black's king. And there's no way to come after these pawns. Right? Because if rook here, if rook... Oh, that is a mouse slip. That's what happens on chess.com. Not fun. Rook e3, this is just a drawn pawn endgame. If the trade ensues. So white's trying to trade rooks, black is declining, and we get a threefold repetition. So a very boring game. But not all of them were boring. So the field is still level. Everyone has half a point. Hopefully tomorrow will be more decisive. You have to think, the more progressive this tournament goes on, the more they're going to need to play for a win. These are the early stages, they can be calm. But once one person has an advantage, they're going to start bugging out and be like, hey, I need a win. Then some will lose with that one mindset, but some will win. And we will get more decisive chess games. That's typically how it works. So, hope you guys enjoyed this recap. This is my first recap. The tournament literally just ended. So, this is going up quickly. But let me know how to improve these recaps as it's my first one. So, I can't imagine it's going to be that great. Let me know if you want the results taken out. I'll figure out how to put the time stamps in without the results. But yeah, constructive criticism could be mean, could be nice. Mean criticism is good, as always. But hope you enjoyed. Have a great day. See you tomorrow for round 2.